days. And that on the third day, she put on her royal robes and she made her unbidden entrance into Xerxes' magnificent 350 square foot throne room. Now, you remember what could happen? What could happen if you went unbidden into the presence of the king?
You could be killed.
You could be killed, yes. And I had my cane 2 weeks ago, and I remember I extended the cane to my wife and said, "You may enter." But, you know, that's why she's not here. She came into my presence without being extended the golden scepter. But seriously, she was risking everything. She was risking her life. She stood in the inner court where guests were in the sight line of the king, and he was seated on his throne. There is an ancient relief sculpture showing an ancient Persian king seated on his throne, holding a long gold scepter and guarded by a soldier holding a large axe. What do you think the axe is for?
To do battle.
Well, protect the king.
Oh, okay.
And if you come unbidden into the presence of the king, you get the axe. And I think when you get the axe back then, you didn't get fired. So this reminds us that Esther was, in fact, risking her life by approaching the king before he had extended his scepter. Now, we're reminded that it was on the third day, after 3 days of communal fasting. The number 3, as if you didn't know, is a very symbolic number in Scripture. In fact, numbers in the Bible are very symbolic. I have a book in my library. It's called Biblical Numerology, and it deals with the significance of numbers in the Bible. But number 3 is very symbolic. If you think back in Scripture, it was on the third day when Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice, but was stopped by an angel. How many days did Jonah spend in the belly of a fish? 3 days. Hosea promised restoration on the third day. And, of course, Jesus was resurrected on the
third day.
So do you get the feeling that 3 might have some significance in the Bible?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. So her unsolicited entry follows the publication of Haman's edict on the 13th day of the first month, which also happens to coincide with the Jewish Passover. By the way, we are in Esther chapter 5. So it coincides with the Jewish Passover. And as you recall, the Passover commemorates freedom and rescue from death by God. So there's a lot of symbolism going on here when Esther goes in to see the king, when she goes into the presence of King Xerxes. Now, when Esther came into the presence of Xerxes, she also knew his reputation. And Xerxes had a reputation, didn't he, as a very, shall we say, fickle personality. Now, someone said a couple weeks ago, I think it was Lawrence, he says, I'm kind of hard on some people in this class. He says, you're kind of hard on Esther. I hope you don't think I'm being hard on Xerxes, but you know, he's a very volatile, fickle individual. And I don't know if you know any people where you just are really careful about how you speak to that person. You ever feel like you're walking on eggshells with a person? Most of you don't know that anybody like that, right?
I do.
But I get the feeling that Xerxes was the kind of guy that you're kind of walking on eggshells when you're around him. You don't know what is going to set him off, so to speak. Anyway, she knew what happened to Vashti, the former queen. Remember the Vashti, the first chapter? And so she must have thought long and hard about coming into the presence of the king without being asked. And since Xerxes would see her standing in the inner court before he talked with her, she would have thought very carefully about what to wear. Don't you think? So I would imagine that she just decided to just kind of put her hair up and put on a sweatsuit. Right?
No way.
No, she would not have done that. She thought very carefully about what she was going to wear. She wanted to command the attention of the man who loved beautiful and compliant wives. Not to mention other beautiful women and even girls, especially women married to other men, such as his brother's wife. Like I said, and again, I don't think I'm being hard on Xerxes because that's just the kind of guy he was. He was what we would call today, you've heard this term, I'm sure, a skirt chaser. Okay, you've heard that term? Okay. The NIV, like most translations, tells us that Esther put on her royal robes. Literally, the Hebrew reads, she put on royalty, or she put on royal dignity. Now, this suggests that her eye-catching finery carried some kind of deep symbolic meaning. And I suspect that we would probably describe her today as drop-dead gorgeous. With apologies to Angie Dickinson, dressed to kill. You know who Angie Dickinson was, right? Okay. Very beautiful woman. She was in a movie called Dressed to Kill. For those, did you ever see that movie?
I do not know.
Yeah, that's an ancient movie.
Brian De Palma.
Brian De Palma, absolutely. There you go. You love movies like I do, I think. Anyway, Dressed to Kill, drop dead gorgeous, eye-catching. The kind of woman that she walks into a room and every male head at least follows. And so one 19th century writer wrote about Xerxes, and I quote, "He was a capricious tyrant, and it might be that her daring would deeply offend him, and instant death would still her beating pulse." Now, the threat of death passes, I think, when Xerxes extends the golden scepter to her, granting her protected access into his presence. By the way, I don't know if you've noticed this, but this is the first time in the story that Esther is directly addressed as Queen Esther. He then offers her up to half the kingdom in verse 3. Now, you probably have seen this before. You've seen it in the book of Daniel. You see it here. But this is an expression that you'll see over and over again in the Old Testament. It was an idiomatic expression. You know what an idiom is, right? An idiom is an expression that we use, and I've used this before, but we have idioms today, such as, he was up the creek without a paddle, which means, it doesn't mean literally he was in a canoe and he lost his paddle. What's it mean?
In trouble.
He was in trouble. He was in deep doo-doo, as we would say. Okay? So that's an idiomatic expression. And it's not meant to be taken literally. It simply means that the king was disposed to be generous in meeting a request. Centuries later, John the Baptist died when Herod did the same thing. He offered up to half his kingdom to the daughter of Herodias, remember? And she asked for the head of John the Baptist. Now, this was made in, this occasion was in the presence of all his officials. And Herodias knew that Herod would not risk losing face by denying her request for the head of John. And so John was killed. He was beheaded. Even though he didn't want to do it, but it was more important that he not lose face in front of his officials. So Esther, however, is not in the presence of all these officials, but she's in the privacy of his throne room. And rather than demanding Haman's head, she takes a more subtle approach. Now, it's interesting when I read this every year. I read the Bible through every year, and I read this, and I always wonder why she takes this approach. I don't know if you do too, but it seems to me that she is very subtle and she kind of beats around the bush. And by the way, by doing this, she creates suspense. In answer to the king's direct question, Esther postpones her answer and instead invites the king to a banquet which she has already prepared. And she asks him to summon Haman too. Now notice the strategy of Esther. To begin with, she hosts Xerxes and Haman in her own quarters, thereby gaining power and control. Clearly, part of her strategy is to find the right moment to discuss Haman's planned genocide of the Jews with her husband. Now, Esther now has Xerxes and Haman, the two most powerful men in the Persian Empire, responding to her initiative. One writer describes the situation like this: from this point onward, we watch Esther's tactics as she deals with Xerxes and Haman, who both need to feel important and love to party. So she is feeding their egos, isn't she? I'm surprised a scholarly writer would say loves to party, But anyway. Xerxes responds quickly and favorably to Esther's request and orders that Haman be brought quickly. Now, someone has humorously pointed out that all of this goes against Xerxes' earlier edict that every man be master of his own house. Remember that? So Xerxes and Haman attend the banquet. And I don't know about you, but the fact that they come, she's playing them like a cheap fiddle. So Xerxes and Haman attend the banquet. Now, if you recall the banquets of Xerxes in chapter 1, what was the emphasis in those banquets? Do you remember?
Drinking.
What's that?
Drinking.
Drinking. Okay. And?
Partying.
Partying. And?
Women.
Women. Wild women. I like this. What else? Pomp and circumstance. We used to have a saying, I don't know if you've heard this, putting on the dog. He was trying to impress his officials. Anyway, so that was Xerxes' 3 banquets. The emphasis was on the splendor and the pomp. Now, the focus in Esther's banquets is on the dialogue. Now, Esther's next move is unexpected. She requests their attendance at a second banquet the next night, at which she will give her request. And that's when I read that every year, I say, what? Why doesn't she just go ahead and get it over with? Don't you? I mean, am I wrong? Does anybody see it differently than I do? Danny, do you see it?
I think
Maureen?
she's trying to to set the scene. She's trying to make him feel comfortable. She's trying to impress him with the food that she's prepared. She wants him to be sort of off guard in a way,
Okay.
so that when she presents her situation, he's going to be more acceptable because of the situation she's created.
Okay. That's another way of looking at it. Yeah, Danny.
Remember, he had not seen Esther for 30 days.
Right.
And so she came in, she was granted the gracious scepter, and then to spring this big ask on the king that quickly might have been a bit much. And so she had already prepared the first of the banquets. That wasn't too much to ask. And then the climactic banquet, a full day later, gave her contact time, reacquaintance time, whatever it took to get the king fully on her side. I really do like this queen.
Okay. There you go. I've always felt uncomfortable with it myself. I guess I probably haven't thought it through, but you may be right. I have been wrong before.
So have I.
Yeah, once I was. Wrong. It's been a long time.
I think the other thing is you can't miss the sovereignty of God here.
Yeah.
Because between the two banquets, we have the next section where Mordecai Haman goes to put the Haman's whatever news, and that the king can't sleep that night.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but one writer describes the situation here. From this point onward, we watch Esther's tactics as she deals with Xerxes and Haman. Oh, who both need to feel, okay, I've already read that. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, this is the quote I wanted here. Marian Taylor, in her commentary, Story of God commentary on Esther, says, against the view that Esther's delaying tactics are a sign of weakness is the more compelling interpretation that her strategies are part of a carefully crafted plan to bolster the egos of both the king and Haman before blindsiding them by exposing Xerxes' second-in-command, Haman, as the manipulative and malevolent enemy of the Jews. Okay, let's move on to verses 9 through 14. Haman builds a gallows to hang Mordecai, or to impale Mordecai would be better. So Haman leaves the banquet. His mood is euphoric, but that is going to quickly change. What is responsible for this rapid mood swing? Well, he sees Mordecai at the king's gate as he passes outside, and Mordecai again, refuses to stand or show fear in his presence. And so we're told that he feels rage towards Mordecai, which he somehow manages to keep under control. Do you get the feeling that Haman has really got a short fuse, a really bad temper? We're left to wonder, why? Oh, why did Mordecai do this again? I mean, after all, it was Mordecai's insolence that led to Haman's edict in the first place. I mean, it's why they're in the place that they are. You know, why did Haman make an edict against the Jews? Because he wanted to get rid of Mordecai. And so he goes and does the same thing again. Why would he risk antagonizing his ancestral enemy once again? Why would you exacerbate a bad situation by doing it over again? I mean, I don't understand it. We're never told why he did it again. And we're never told what was going through his mind. But it just seems to me that Mordecai was making a bad situation worse.
Yeah, but
Go ahead.
it seems to me like he's just doing what he's been taught all his life, to not bow before anybody but God.
Okay. All right.
The same thing, I mean, he's honoring God, he doesn't care about human
Okay.
reaction.
That's if you take the view that he's trying to honor God by not bowing down to him or rising. And we talked about different reasons why he might not be doing it. And I mean, personally, if I had been in that situation, I would have done it just to get his goat. That's just the kind of person I am. Of course, I know none of you are like that.
Shall we call you Mordecai here?
But anyway, to make a long story short, or a short story long, Haman controls his emotions and goes home. Once he gets home, he unleashes his inner turmoil, his excessive pride, his egotism. He begins to brag about his accomplishments, his wealth, his many sons, and how the king has honored him. We would use the expression, he was full of himself, wasn't he? And then irony upon irony, he boasts about the invitation to Esther's banquet, not knowing, now look at the irony in all of this, not knowing that she was a Jew and that he had issued a decree, an edict against the Jews, and he doesn't know that she's a Jew and that she's been raised by Mordecai. That's all kept secret. Ironically, while Haman is boasting about the things he really values and flaunts this, with everybody, I think it foreshadows the final outcome of the story, when Haman's riches are given to Esther and Haman's sons are killed by the Jews. Do you see that? I see the foreshadowing here. And so in a rare moment of surprising self-awareness and vulnerability, Haman confesses in verse 13 that the very sight of Mordecai sitting in the king's gate just flips him out. Did you say flips him out?
I did.
There you go. I like that. Flips him out. It takes away all of the satisfaction from all of his honors. It gets under his skin. And his wife and friends, we're told that they're his wife and friends at this point. That's going to change later on, by the way. But his wife and his friends give him some advice, which in his hubris he decides to follow. He is advised to have a gallows built 75 feet tall on which to impale Mordecai. Not hang him in the sense of, the Old West. You remember, our idea of a gallows is, you're building a gallows in an Old West town and you're going to hang the horse thief or the murderer, right? That's not what they're talking about. Yeah, what you would do is you would impale him on the gallows. And so this is what he does, and he believes that this is going to solve all of his problems. Now, let me just say a word about the gallows. Again, this is not like we see in the Old West movies in which the guy's hanged. It was rather a pole on which a person would be impaled. Now, this method fits in with what we know about Persian execution practices and post-death humiliation. You would leave the person impaled to get a message across. And I understand that you've heard of Vlad the Impaler. They didn't just do that because they were being nice to him. They gave him that name because he impaled people. And he would leave them there as a message to his enemies. So, if you mess with me, this is what happens to you. Right? So, the pole's height of 50 cubits or 75 feet seems to be a bit exaggerated in light of what we know about the relative height of ancient Persian structures. Let me give you some perspective. Okay, this gallows is supposed to be 75 feet tall. The 36 colossal columns which supported the roof of the great audience hall at Susa, where the king was only 45.9 cubits high, or 21 meters. That would be 68.9 feet. So the gallows was higher than the king's palace. Why would Haman's gallows need to be so high?
Would that be so the king could watch this happen?
Well, that may well be. That's a good idea. I never thought about that. Yeah.
So that everyone could see the result.
Yeah.
Throughout the town.
Okay. Good. Good. And he desperately wanted to see Mordecai shamed and humiliated in addition to his death. In other words, he really wanted to rub it in. So it wasn't enough to just kill Mordecai. He really, wanted to rub it in. Yeah.
Like the Philistines and Saul.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I shouldn't probably use this illustration. My wife says I get off too many rabbit trails, but in The Wild Bunch, remember that movie, The Wild Bunch? I know Gordon has seen it, but probably nobody else here has. But they have this guy, Sam Peckinpah. Very, very violent movie, but this guy is tied to a car, and he's driven around. And so long after he's dead, they keep driving it around, as a message to people. So, yeah, Sam Peckinpah, one of the most violent movie directors of all time.
Straw Dogs.
Straw Dogs, another one. Dustin Hoffman and Susan George. Yes. Of course, I've never seen it. Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. Did you see that one? Yeah. Okay, well, anyway, like I said, my wife says I get off on too many false trails. Let me give you something about Haman, and I'm going to need some people here to read for me in just a minute. I need someone to read Proverbs 11:2. Volunteer, raise your hand. Raise your hand. Okay, Susan. And then Proverbs 16:5 and 16:18. Raise your hand.
And take care of
Okay.
16:5. Yeah.
All right. So we've got probably the biggest problem that Haman had was with pride. Would you agree with that? He was a very prideful individual. Now, what does the Bible teach about pride?
It come up before a fall.
Absolutely. It's followed by
Destruction.
disgrace. Proverbs 11:2. Please read that.
When pride comes, then comes shame, but with the humble is wisdom.
Okay. It leads to shame. And then it also leads to punishment. Proverbs 16:5.
Everyone who is arrogant in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Be assured he will not go unpunished.
Okay. And then it leads to a fall and destruction. Proverbs 16:18.
Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall.
Okay. Thank you. Now, all of these are going to be experienced by Haman by the end of the story. So, next, a word about Esther. Did you know that the freed slave Sojourner Truth, you've heard of Sojourner Truth, perhaps, was inspired less by Esther's tactics than by her courage and risking her life to advocate on behalf of the oppressed? She argued that the women of America needed to bring their requests courageously before the King of the United States. she found it ironic that Esther was well received when she asked for the deliverance of her people, but American women who ask for much less hear, and I quote, "Sons hiss their mothers like snakes because they ask for their rights, and can they ask for anything less?" If you don't know who Sojourner Truth was, she was a black woman, former slave, and she fought tirelessly for against slavery and for women's rights. So let's move on to chapter 6, and we're going to stop with chapter 6. This passage, verses 1 through 9, has been seen by many as the most ironically comic scene in the entire Bible. While Haman plots Mordecai's death, the king plans to honor Mordecai's faithful service. As Karen Jobes writes, an unsuspecting Haman enters the king's court where he magnificently trips over his own pride. Verse 6 records the thoughts of Haman. Who is there that the king would rather honor than me? You know, when he tells him he wants to honor, you know, what do we do for the man that the king wants to honor? Now, if there's ever a picture of pride going before the fall, I think this is surely it. This is the epitome of pride going before the fall. Now, I said this is an ironically comic scene. This chapter has a chain of seemingly random, believable coincidences, all converging at the same time. I hesitate to use another movie, but Sebastian Junger wrote a book called Perfect Storm, which was made into a movie with, who was the star of that movie? Clooney, George Clooney. Yeah, guy looks just like me. Okay, just... But a perfect storm, a perfect chain of events is what a perfect storm is. And that's what we have here, isn't it? All of these things just happen to converge at the same time. The king just happens to have a bout of insomnia. Now, I don't know how you would do that as much drinking as he did. He just happens to have the chronicles of his reign read to him instead of going and checking emails. The story of Mordecai's loyalty just happens to come to his attention at the very moment when Haman just happens to be plotting against Mordecai. And keep in mind that this is 5 years after the fact. 5 years after Mordecai uncovered the plot. A Hollywood scriptwriter couldn't have written it better than this. And many of us would say that it was God who caused the insomnia. That God was behind all of these events. And so after leaving the banquet with Queen Esther, Xerxes is unable to sleep. And so he did what a lot of us do. I don't know about you, but if I wake up in the middle of the night and I can't go to sleep, I get up and I write a book. But what I used to do is I would get up, 1 or 2 in the morning, and I would read until I put myself back to sleep. And hopefully I would read something that was really boring, like one of my books. Now, something that really would put you to sleep. Right now I'm reading Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's like 600 and some pages. And I get about 10 pages and I'm out at night. So it really puts me to sleep. But anyway, he decides to read a book. And so actually he has the book of the Chronicles of his reign brought to him and read. He's so important he doesn't actually have to read for himself. So he has somebody else do it for him. And from this official transcript, the king would draw up a list of those who were to be rewarded for faithful service to the throne. And he discovers an oversight, doesn't he? Now, it was important that Persian kings publicly reward those who were loyal as a means of promoting their own safety in treacherous times. It was common protocol for ancient kings to promptly honor, reward, and publicly acknowledge those who provided exceptional service. Failure to honor someone promptly was considered very poor form and a serious breach of protocol. I don't know if you follow baseball but I'm a big baseball fan, and I just think it's a shame that Gil Hodges just made the Hall of Fame. Why is it such a shame? I mean, I believe for many years he's been deserving of the Baseball Hall of Fame, but he's been dead for a number of years now. And I hate to see these guys get in after they die. They don't get to, bask in the honor of it. But the Persian kings would honor people immediately. Such honorees were often awarded gifts that include land, money, and prestigious positions of power, which would be symbolized by special clothes and accessories worn before an adoring public. What was the color of a royal robe?
Purple.
Purple, yes. They might have a parade in their honor. You'll recall that Pharaoh honored Joseph in the book of Genesis with a signet ring and had him dressed up in fine linen robes adorned with a gold chain, placed him in the second chariot, I think that would be Air Force Two, and put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Now, there's also evidence that animals were used in such ceremonies. This is very similar, I think, to Haman's wish list. One description listed a horse with a gold-mounted bridle, a gold necklace and bracelets, a gold dagger, and a Persian robe. Archaeologists have even uncovered many depictions of decorated horses and ornamented horse figurines in their excavations of the ancient Near East. So this was very, very common practice. Now, Xerxes acts very quickly to rectify his oversight. He says, how did this happen? How did this go, under my notice for 5 years? So true to his character, he looks to others to advise him what to do. He doesn't act on his own. So the king asks, who is in the court? Another coincidence. Guess who's there? Shazam! Who is it? It's Haman! Holy smokes! He just happened to have just entered the palace to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows. What a coincidence, right? Xerxes needs Haman's advice, and Haman needs permission to kill Mordecai. Now, I don't know if any of you see the comedy in all of this. Nobody?
No.
I think this is hilarious. It's tremendously ironic. God makes certain that Haman is available at just the right moment to solve the king's dilemma, but in such a way as so to entrap himself. And so this story is full of divine coincidence, and the timing is perfect. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to the Baseball Hall of Fame, but they have a very, very famous Bud Abbott and Abbott and Costello skit. It's called Who's on First? Have you ever seen it?
What's on second?
It's about an 8-minute comedy sketch that is just hilarious. But and it's on a continuous loop at the Baseball Hall of Fame, but it's hilarious. The timing is just perfect. Split-second timing. And it's become a standard for burlesque comics across the United States. And so after Haman enters the court, Xerxes immediately asks him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman, of course, what's he thinking?
It's me. Yeah.
He's the one that Xerxes plans to honor. And his response is predicated on his erroneous assumption. I will never forget, almost 20 years ago now, I was called into the president at what was called, it was New Life Theological Seminary back then, before it became Charlotte Christian College and Theological Seminary. But I was summoned into the office of the president, whom I did not know real well. And I thought, oh gosh, what did I do now? What did I say? I must have offended some student, you know? And so I went in thinking, okay, I'm going to get the axe, right? And he asked me to be the academic dean.
Oh my goodness.
Which is the Peter principle at work, you know, someone being promoted to his level of incompetence. I'm kidding. I actually was very successful as the dean, but completely unexpected outcome. And so he thinks that he's the one that Xerxes plans to honor. And his response is predicated on this erroneous assumption. Therefore, the narcissistic Haman, and I can't call him anything but a narcissist, he inadvertently maps out his own downfall. And it's at this point that the great reversal of fortune that lies at the center of this book begins, as we see clearly the providence of God and God's fingerprints over all of what is happening. Do you see God's fingerprints here? I do. And so Haman's answer to Xerxes tells us a lot about Haman, doesn't it? It reflects an obsession with all things that are royal, including, it would seem, a fantasy of being king. I was surprised to see that some writers think that he wanted to be king. In verses 7 and 8, the Hebrew root word for king, melech, is used 7 times. Many writers have suggested that Haman, at least on a subconscious level, wanted to be king. The only thing missing from his wish list is a sexual relationship with the king's wife, which is exactly what Xerxes is going to accuse Haman at the banquet which will follow. That's next week. It would be much the same thing as if a person asked the President of the United States to allow him the use of Air Force One as his personal taxi service. If I told you that the president wanted me to use Air Force One from now on, you'd probably treat me a little differently, wouldn't you? Well, wouldn't you? You know, you'd probably say, well, you know, this guy's, you know, there's more to him than we thought he was. You know, he's got the ear of the president. But, you know, somebody who was using Air Force One as a personal taxi service would certainly elevate that person in the eyes of the world. It would elevate how people perceived him in terms of power and prestige. And I think that this is what Haman is doing. He wants to be elevated in terms of power and prestige. Now, it will be done in about 3 minutes here. In verses 10 through 14, Mordecai is honored and Haman is distressed. And could someone look up Psalm 9:16 for me? Gordon, could you do that, please? Psalm 9:16. Immediately, Xerxes reveals the identity of his honoree, and to Haman's utter chagrin, he discovers that it's Mordecai. My. The king's last words, do not neglect anything you have recommended. Wouldn't you just love to be able to see into Haman's mind and learn what he was thinking at that point?
Or the look on his face.
Or the look on his face. I think it would have been priceless. He was undoubtedly, absolutely mortified. And I think we see what the psalmist was talking about when he described the wicked man in Psalm 9:16. Go ahead.
The Lord is known by his acts of justice. The wicked are ensnared by the work of their hands.
perfect description of Haman. Now, after all of this takes place, Mordecai returns to the king's gate, but Haman rushes home and tells his wife everything, as well as his friends. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? They all reversed their earlier advice. Now, and it's also interesting, I think, that the day before they were identified as his wife Zeresh and all his friends. Now, notice the change here. After he tells them his tale of woe, they are now identified as his advisors and his wife Zeresh. I think they demoted themselves. They've certainly changed their tune. Now they say to him, "You cannot stand against him," thus foreshadowing his fate. And Marion Taylor in her commentary writes, "Perhaps it is not surprising that wicked Haman would surround himself with such depraved people." There's an oft-repeated story that Haman's daughter, and again, this is a rabbinic story, and so you can buy it or you don't have to. It's kind of apocryphal. But the oft-repeated story is that Haman's daughter threw a pot of excrement from the roof on the head of a man that she thought was Mordecai, but was really Haman.
Wow.
That's a rabbinic story. It's been repeated for centuries. And I think that story underscores Haman's deep sense of shame. The story ends when, after Haman told his daughter that she had also embarrassed him, she fell or jumped off the roof and died. Now, chapter 6 ends with the king's eunuchs arrive, and they hurried Haman away to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And I did not want to start with chapter 7 this week, so we're going to stop there. And does anybody have any questions or thoughts about what we covered today? Denny?
While you were teaching chapters 5 and 6, I was thinking this is why Esther is included among the 66 books of the Bible.
Okay. Because of the twisting of events and everything?
Yes, those old scholars from long ago had to be astounded by how this all came together.
Yeah. Any of you ever read Agatha Christie? You know she is, right? Agatha Christie. You know, she has a lot of twists and turns in her books. You know, it's just amazing, some of the coincidences, isn't it? So, any other thoughts? Well, let me get a count real quick here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, thank you.
Three people left.
I know, I got them. So, they just couldn't stand it, could they? Well, thank you for being here. We're right on track, I think, to finish this on time.